have the pleasure of sitting with Reverend Jarrett Kerbel, and you are the priest in charge here at All Angels Church in New York. So I'm thinking about another music analogy to what you said earlier about listening to people in the congregation, just being aware of different voices. When I play the piano, there's counterpoint, there's different lines going on at the same time, and the importance of performing it so that everyone can be heard is that each voice has to come to the foreground and then back away, and they take turns.
Okay.
And sometimes they're exactly the same volume, and sometimes they move together, but there's this relationship between the voices. Now, when we talk about chamber music, however, there's always going to be times where one person is a better listener than another, and it becomes really tricky and messy. So, yeah, because you really are dependent on other people hearing you to move forward, right?
Totally.
So when we're talking about everyone being some sort of an activist in order to make progress in our collective whole,
right?
We can all practice listening, but then on the other end, we have no control over being heard. And the activist's viewpoint from what I'm hearing is very much that we're going to fight to be heard. Whereas the Christian viewpoint is much more of waiting and patience and turn the other cheek and absorbing the violence, absorbing the rejection. So is there a way to reconcile those two things for people who are Christians and activists? What do you do with that?
That's a great question. That's really a good question. So I'm going to start with the turn the other cheek and work from there. I got to read a guy named Walter Wink when I was in seminary, and Walter Wink's a biblical scholar who did a lot of work in South Africa during apartheid. And he learned something about that passage, so apartheid, of course, an experience of great racially based oppression and violence, is that people in South Africa, black South Africans had a reading of that passage that transformed it for Wink, and he confirmed it through his research of the Greek and the situation, is that in the ancient world, if someone slapped you, if it was a higher class figure over a lower class figure, they would slap you with the back of their hand. That was a slap of disrespect. So in this reading, when you turn your other cheek, you're forcing them to slap you with their open hand, which is how equals slap each other. And so this reading I find fascinating because it's not just taking it, it's also resistance. Both are happening there. So we're not just being counseled by Jesus to accept violence. We're being counseled to resist violence non-violently without getting caught up in it and without accepting that person's, insult of us. So it's a powerful, and actually there's two other parts of that story. When a soldier forces you to carry his things for 1 mile, go 2 miles. And legally he could do that. He could force you for 1, but he couldn't force you for 2. So after that first mile, you're being generous. You're coming up to his level as an equal. And it's an interesting form of resistance, right? And so we saw this with Dr. King and nonviolent resistance, and we've seen it in a lot of great movements for justice where you practice nonviolent resistance. You're not just endlessly patient, you force the issue, you make the issue public and visible, but you don't just lay down and accept the injustice. So I think that's a very Christ-like approach, personally, from just thinking about how he lived his life and the tension that he got into and the conflicts that happened because of his life, which he did not react violently to, which is a lesson to us. So, but that's what's kind of missing in the current world of activism as the United States gets more secular and as younger generations become more secular. They don't have the resources of prayer and the resources of community and the resources of kind of spiritual formation and training that you really need to do nonviolence, because like all the nonviolent leaders did tons of training and had deep spiritual roots. You know, people mistakenly think Rosa Parks just sat down on the bus. No, she actually went to the Highlander Institute in Tennessee and spent weeks studying nonviolence. I mean, she was a student of the movement, and that gets missed sometimes. But in activism, yeah, there's the yelling form of activism, the kind of demand-making form of activism. I tend not to think of myself in those terms. I come from a background called community organizing, which is much more listening based and much more working with people toward practical solutions over time by building power. Whereas activism is, marching in the streets, that kind of thing. And I don't think activism actually always works very well. I don't think the results are always there. There's times that call for it when you just have to make a witness to something. Like I was on the streets a lot after George Floyd was killed. I was operating as what was called a movement chaplain. So I was wearing my clerical collar and a cross and a sign that says a movement chaplain. So I was there to minister to people, support people, love people. But I was there because we needed to make a showing that this was wrong. And if that had happened and no one had reacted, it would have been kind of a tacit acceptance. Yeah. Like, oh, nothing bad happened there. Mm-hmm. And something horrible happened there that tapped into a lot of historic anger. So we needed to be on the streets in that moment, even though I was never fooling myself that being on the streets was going to change a lot.
What do you think is the biggest barrier for people to come into the church or to explore the faith?
It's a great question. One I think about a lot. I think it's the church's own history. I think the biggest barrier is our own history of doing really cruel things and being unkind and being nasty and judgmental and segregationist and exclusive. And, I think we've been our own worst enemy in almost all cases, and something we always have to repent for. It's really only God's power in the church that makes the church worth it. The human part, we're pretty fallible, and we should know that because of our teachings, but we can be really self-righteous and really impenetrable to criticism. And currently, in the current moment, a lot of the voices out there that represent the church are kind of harsh. They're kind of the loudest, the harshest, get the news. And I think, especially younger generations, I know are painting the whole church through that lens, right? The whole church is really negative because of our loudest spokespeople who don't speak for me, but they're sure in the media, and it's always some flashpoint issue. It's always something, it's very tricky right now. The church has not done a good job putting Jesus forward and helping people respond to Jesus. I think we put all kinds of other stuff out there, culture war stuff, So.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been awesome.
This has been really fun. Thank you.